Let's not touch the mic. Sounds good. Yeah, no, that's why I'm exactly. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here. It's also great to see that we have some people in the room. We were always, especially after everything that we've been through, and then also a topic that's never been covered before. So we did not really have anything to go by. So thanks all for being here. First of all, I'd like to thank, Maja Hinsberg for organizing the event, and Maja Kivinen provided excellent comments along the way while we were through the production process. Then comments within the Institute, Katja Kreutz, we had Charlie a couple of rounds, Mikael Vigela, who was one of the original people to, also to see the light on this. And of course, look forward to what Laura has to say here as well today. And I did not, even though we met beforehand, I made sure not to inquire what her comments are going to be on. So I will be receiving them in real time and hopefully be able to respond to those as well. And of course, the opinions left in the paper, they're only mine. Just to mention sort of about the background here. I mean, I think Charlie also asked to sort of talk about my own connection with the topic. I said I live in Washington. For several years, I was a Latin American history lecturer at Harvard, and Brazil was always my expertise. But at the same time, along the way, I got to teach a fair bit of Mexican history, literature, and other topics as well, the economy, politics. And then sort of early last year, I started wondering whether, there might be some, I admit at this point, relatively long tail implications from the domestic situation in Mexico. And what at the time seemed to be relatively quickly deteriorating diplomatic relations with the United States, a moment where people were not really very clear in Washington whether the president of Mexico would show up to a summit or not for some weeks, ended up not coming there. But there was a spark that really made its way above a certain threshold. As a result, I came up with this idea that I go spend the week of the Summit of Americas of the Cumbre in Mexico City instead of Washington. And there I was sort of going around talking to people for that week when this was all going down. And then in the aftermath of that, wrote this paper and spent, several months trying to edit it and get it to the right place along the way. So it's in some ways a paper that has 3 different papers built into it. The first one is about Mexico's internal development, and it no longer contains longer dissertations on Mexican 19th century history, but rest assured it was there at one point. It's also a paper about Mexico-US relations, much beyond the single issue of the wall. There was a version in the fall that did not have the wall mentioned even once. And then someone pointed out that, by the way, when we speak about this in Finland, is the only thing that people will know. So you should probably reintegrate the wall. And I did that. It's now in there. And then there's perhaps the hook. And I admit that I'm getting a bit more adventurous than, some might like. But at the same time, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America just 20 years ago. So there are processes within Mexico that have parallels with the experience in Venezuela 20 years ago. And I think some of those should be brought to the fore. Is it going to be exactly the same road to Caracas? I don't think so. First of all, Mexico is a much, much bigger country. Its ties with the United States at a societal level, an everyday level, cultural level, are much, much, much closer. And also, business ties are incredibly strong. But that's sort of the background. I'll go over these sort of 3 different papers in a little bit more detail now, and then I'll return to conclusions that I hope that hopefully connect all the papers together. So the first question to pose, I think, is there really democratic decay? Or are we simply witnessing a very popular president of the people? I realize that I'm, in a country where the president has about 90% popularity. AMLO in Mexico has only 60%. So it's a sort of curious place to be making these comments. So and there's also a very strong sense that I've gotten from many Mexicans, but also outsiders, as part of Mexico became a full multi-party democracy this century, 2000. And then there was a sense that, after the conservative PAN had a couple of presidencies, the PRI that had ruled through much of the 20th century had a presidency, that Mexico is also due a president of the left. And AMLO is a tremendously popular figure. He's also in many ways, I think, a peculiar figure in, many may have read about how he tried to sell off the private jet, the presidential jets, and these kinds of moves that really endeared him to much of the Mexican people. But then a lot of people who in 2008, when AMLO became president, who wanted to see him succeed, wanted him to emerge as something like a Lula-type figure from Brazil, became relatively quickly also disappointed, disillusioned, and then I think it's fair to say that by the time you reach 2022, or maybe even 2021 already, they started to get very concerned. Many trends are pointing in the direction that Mexico's democracy is probably not doing as well as it should have. I mean, and then people who were always skeptical of AMLO, of President López Obrador from the get-go, started reminding, by the way, he was the original election denier in 2006. No wonder he's now going after the National Electoral Commission, wants to have it directly voted. There've just been some news pieces floating around a couple of days ago that he'll be firing 5,000 people who work for the Electoral Commission. So really a sort of gutting of the electoral machinery as it has existed in Mexico's transition to democracy. There are many other examples then that, from different sectors. Some people think that some of them are more serious, others are less serious. Lots of journalists being killed. This is while the United States is generally reticent to make too many comments about Mexico's internal affairs, this is something that Secretary Blinken has mentioned. I know the European embassies in Mexico have also been talking about this as a topic that is a sort of a great concern. But then Mexico's cartels, how much territory they control, the involvement in politics, and especially in certain states, and then nationalization in the energy sector has been one thing that's been going on, but also the broader reach of the military in the economy. That the military is involved. The paper starts with an anecdote or the case where the sort of partly built airport, new airport in Mexico City is canceled, and instead there's a military air base that's then taken over as the new potential airport. This is, in some ways, this was a gesture in the direction of the president's frugal ways, but at the same time, it's, there's a sense of the military being involved in, broader parts of society. And then there are questions of femicide and also violence against sexual and gender minorities. These were issues that were actually addressed, and they were part of the documents coming out of the Three Amigos Summit, National North American Leaders Summit that just happened earlier this month. So those are some of the issues internally. Then the U.S. relations, and it's big. It's the big neighbor, also where 80% of Mexico's exports go. But the way that much of the world has been reading about this topic over the last few years has been through this the border conversation. And here, the big problem is that you take an incredibly complicated relationship like that like the one that the U.S. and Mexico have, and U.S. President Donald Trump made the decision at one point to start mixing issues. So he said that, if the flow of migrants does not stop, we're going to have 5% tariffs, which of course means that you're crossing from one bucket of issues to another bucket of issues. And there are many such instances where you end up, where people end up, speaking cross purposes and not actually tackling the issue at hand. And it doesn't necessarily result in issues being tackled the way they should be. More recently, the fentanyl deaths in the U.S. is one in prominent context in which Mexico comes up. So in the last year, over 100,000 people died of opioids in the United States. And there's now language in recent months being circulating around the U.S. comparing this, saying that fentanyl is a WMD. And what's important to understand in this context, that the ingredients that Mexican cartels receive are usually sourced in China. And therefore, when it's being called an opium war, it's, people, when they call it an opium war, they know who they're pointing fingers at. So this is just a development that's only now growing, and it's something that's sort of gathering pace in the United States as we speak. There are many issues that go also in the other direction. 90% of those apprehended with guns at the border, going from the U.S. to Mexico, are U.S. citizens. So guns are being smuggled in the other direction. So that really just speaks to the complications of the relationship. And one thing, recently, Donald Trump announced that he was going to be running again, which my understanding is the campaign starts this weekend. But when he made that announcement, there are a couple of things. He spent a lot of time in Mexico. One thing he mentioned was that he's going to protect Americans from fentanyl, but he also called AMLO a great man, a socialist, but a great man. So something to keep in mind. Then going into, maybe, something that might be more high diplomacy or just a sort of diplomatic spat. But, and this is part of the origin story of this paper. It's only a small part of the paper now, but it's the Summit of the Americas, which is a post-Cold War regime set up in the Clinton years, idea being that this would be the forum in which US-led Western hemispheric integration could take place. So this is where the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas was discussed. And this time, the U.S., the U.S. had decided, based on my understanding, one of the reasons why this summit would be in Los Angeles would be that it would be focusing on the U.S.-Mexico relationship and really taking away from Miami and questions of the greater Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean. So it would not be about Cuba, it would not be about Venezuela. Then it became a matter of the invitation list. And especially tricky was the question of the leadership of Venezuela, because many of them are wanted for narco terrorism on U.S. soil. So having them on U.S. soil would not be an option. And then Cuba is always Cuba, and then Nicaragua was also sort of part of the equation. So AMLO decided to take the step to saying that if they're not coming, I'm not going either. And this went on for several weeks, and it was not clear who was going to show up. In the end, he was not there. And this raised many eyebrows in Washington. People started wondering that it's one thing to think that everybody should be invited. It's another move to try to derail this and also derail the summit and at the same time, clearly being, sort of be seen as being carrying water for these dictators of the greater Caribbean. So that's one question. I already mentioned the energy nationalization. So Mexico had already this the booming green energy sector. The president has shown great preference for state companies, for fossil fuels, exploration of fossil fuels. So, and on the sort of green energy side, there are many foreign and many of them U.S. interests in the in the tens of billions. But this is something that neither side. I mean, there is a dispute going on under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, but at the same time, nobody wants to escalate it too high, nor necessarily resolve it right now either. So it is an issue that seems to be laying low for the meanwhile. Since this sort of paper has been taking its many forms, what has become obvious from September visit by for U.S. Secretaries Blinken and Raimondo in Mexico, as well as all the way through the North America Leaders Summit, that the U.S. is putting all of its investments, all of its tariff power behind Mexico. That Mexico is going to be, together with Canada, integrated into this North American nearshoring and friendshoring framework. And obviously, there have been many noises made in Europe about the protectionist elements in the Inflation Reduction Act. But the idea is that Mexico and Canada would remain within those boundaries instead of outside those boundaries. This, may involve microchips production, PPP, critical minerals, the whole list of supply chains. So there's a growing sense that Mexico is very important for the United States. But at the same time, there's a hangover from the Trump years in the Biden administration, which means that there is a sort of reluctance to speak of the many issues and the many reasons why people should worry about the domestic development in Mexico, in the first instance, for the sake of Mexicans themselves. So, and now I move to the third part of the paper. That's been 1, 2. The third part, and here I think we probably go on a bit more of a ride in the first place. There's early on in the paper, there's a reminder of the Zimmermann telegram. Zimmermann telegram 106 years ago, the Germans were trying to coax the Mexicans into World War I by saying that we will help fund your recovery of much of the lands that you lost to the United States in 1846 through 1848 in the Mexican-American War. So it's often that we know about this, but it's often forgotten that one of the main reasons, if not according to many historians, the main reason the U.S. public went along with the U.S. direct entry into European relations and balancing power in Europe was because of Mexico, was because of the possibility that Germany might open the Mexican border. Of course, there's also the case of Cuba and the Soviet Union, where unlike what I've called sort of the internal decay and deterioration of Venezuela, in the case of Venezuela, you have the sort of road to Havana, which is about a regime seeking internal security through an external pivot. We are not here yet with Mexico as a sort of potential pivot state, but there are elements in the picture that make me wonder about maybe why people should be paying attention. People should not be taking for granted that history sort of sits still. And we should be considering what it might mean if the U.S. became a normal country that's primarily focused on its own border, on its relations with its own neighbors. So, and I say this because AMLO himself, many members of his party are open admirers of the Cuban Revolution as well. In addition to, for example, this military airport at the military air base, the first new airline to use it was actually Conviasa, which is the Venezuelan national carrier. So there are these kinds of linkages that are very strongly present and increasingly present in Mexico. But at the same time, Mexico remains, it belongs to the OECD, the USMCA is in place. There might simply be too much wind in the sails of investment that wants to come to Mexico, regardless of everything. And we should keep that sort of counterbalancing force in mind as well. That, you know, there's a sense that the US does not want to ship everything across the oceans, especially across the Pacific, in case all these goods manufactured different parts of Asia, in case of a war in the Pacific, and therefore having much more of that production in Mexico would be a much better idea. But the situation is different now. There is we're looking at a near peer rival to the US, and it's worth considering that other alternatives are also present. Okay, so final words. This is a little bit about Europe. For Europe, it's a mixed picture. I mean, AMLO has been very vocal about how he thinks that NATO's involvement in Ukraine is immoral. The Russian alternative, the GPS, GLONASS, is building infrastructure now in Mexico, or Mexico's building infrastructure for it. And AMLO's seen the sort of future Beijing-Moscow axis in addition to this admiration for, and the future in that axis, in addition to this admiration for the Cuban revolution in the background. So people, it's difficult to, in some ways, to say what I'm going to say next, which is that the best thing that I think that the EU right now could do is update as quickly as possible the existing free trade agreement, try to approximate as much with Mexico as possible. This would help, amongst other things, diversify the export trade with the US, which is now at around 80%, a little bit, which maybe then, releases some of the sentiments around angsts about the US-Mexican relationship as well, if Mexican trade relations with the rest of the world become somewhat more diversified. But I think that's, the point with which I would sort of like to leave this. And it's a sort of contradictory message from what we've been perhaps hearing in the last couple of years, especially in the last year, where this idea has really been that soon we should be only trading with people who agree with us on everything. And I think the case of Mexico really presents the possibility of investment trade as a possibility that allows you to also keep those who may not see eye to eye with you on everything, make sure that they stay at least sort of relatively close to you on sort of many things that matter most. So that's I think, the best I can do in trying to capture the paper as it is.
Thank you. And I will not even get up, but rather just ask Laura to take it away from here then with your comments. You can either one.
Okay, sure. Here we go. All right, so first of all, thank you, Laura. That was very insightful overview of the paper, and I find the whole paper as a really nice summary of what's going on in and around Mexico. It summarizes really well the internal context and also the relations with the US and the other parts of the world. First of all, the first question of yours is there democratic decay in Mexico? For sure, I would say yes. The country's democracy is in debt, but it's grievously ill, we would say. So the point of view from which I'm talking is that I'm like Charlie said in the beginning, I'm a journalist working for the MTV News, and I spent some months last year in New York, working from that side of the border. But before, I've been living in Mexico in 2015 and 2018, studying and working there. So I've seen a little bit life on both sides of the border. So 2018, when AMLO, López Obrador, was elected, there was a really actually positive vibe around him. He was considered as a new type of leftist president after all the years of PRI, and he was considered kind of president of the poor, president of indigenous people, of women, speaking from the different angle than the previous ones. But obviously he was struggling with the same. He just got the same issues than the previous presidents. There was corruption, there was crime, narco traffics, and so on, and the raging violence around Mexico, as well as the economic challenges. So first, he actually was promoting during his campaign the different ways how he could battle the corruption and crime, such as he was promoting ideas like negotiating with the narco bosses, or letting those low-level criminals from prison free, but they were really debated and people weren't really welcoming those ideas with open arms. So slowly, as we've seen during the past years, his touch has changed quickly, and now it's becoming more and more authoritarian slowly. So superficially, López Obrador's Morena party looks nothing like PRI, the previous presidents, but from the outside, I mean, he's been like all the politicians in Mexico. He has been part of PRI movement in 70s, 80s, and he knows how it works, how power works in Mexico, and he can adapt those also in his own game. So like you said, his approval rating hovers around 60%, so he is incredibly popular, but he cannot, in 2024 there will be the next elections, but he cannot run for president because there's only one term that he can take. But of course, he's trying to pave the way for the next Morena president, perhaps the mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, or some other. Of course, he hasn't said it out loud, but it seems like the press is at least saying that might be the option. So yeah, and he's also attacking press, which I might go back later. Also the National Electoral Institute, INE, which has been also launching some demonstrations late last year. He wants to launch his own panel for this democratic institution, and he's been trying to reorganize the whole setting of the institute so that it could influence in the next elections. But you also write in your paper about the violence, and you ask what is holding Mexico back when it comes to economy, and you answer aloud in your text that the answer is crime. There is very volatile security situation in most corners of the country, like you write, and for many it's simply too dangerous to operate in Mexico. So that has been the biggest challenge for sure. When it comes to, for example, I would like to highlight the situation of press and journalists that you mentioned, because of course I cannot be mentioning it as a representative of the press. Just a few days ago, El Financiero and some other media outlets were releasing the latest numbers, and Mexico is the second most dangerous country on earth for journalists, just behind Ukraine, and Ukraine has a war, which is quite striking. In Mexico, the number was last year there were 13 journalists killed, and even more are missing, and that's quite striking. And when we talk about the democratic decay in Mexico, it's quite striking how AMLO has also attacked members of the press, in his everyday press conferences, attack them, saying that they are lying, and choosing like kind of making justice, or not justice, but kind of paving way for the violence against press members. Another thing that you mentioned, which I find interesting to highlight, important to highlight, is violence against women, which is what I've been following quite closely. Feminicides, so killings of women that happen because of their gender, it's about 10% of all the homicides that happen in Mexico. There are around 30,000 homicides a year in the country, and about 3,000 of them are against women. But what is so striking is that there are systems, there are programs that are trying to tackle the problem, but they are not enough. They are simply not enough. The patriarchal culture and impunity in the courtrooms is simply just allowing this to happen. And normally the perpetrators are just walking free. The women do not get justice. So also, I'm happy in your paper you didn't focus only on the border or the wall, which is normally, if we ever read news from Mexico or from the region, it's quite often it's all about migrants and the wall. And I'm happy you mentioned it, but you don't write only about the wall. But on the other hand, the interesting point you make here, this mixing of issues, how trade and how migration are kind of intertwined, that is very important notice to have, what we, I think, don't understand completely here. And what kind of, you mentioned it's a deal with the devil, and I think that's a very precise way to put it. So how Mexico prevents the influx of migrants to the United States, then it gets economical benefit from the US, and how then, for example, Biden isn't really taking strong opinions on it. For example, in this North American Leaders Summit earlier in January, people were really expecting Biden would mention something about democracy in Mexico, but instead of saying that he would be somehow worried about it, he actually said that he was somehow, I don't remember what was exact word, but he was saying his content, how AMLO has been actually promoting democracy in Mexico, which was quite a statement to say. And overall, you mentioned the dynamics of the relationships between Mexico and the US, and then Mexico and the authoritarian regimes such as Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, even China, Russia. And I'm happy you said it, so I didn't have to say it, that you mentioned that there's a comparison to Venezuela and the parallels of the way you mentioned there's the hue, and you said it's adventurous way to put it, and I'm happy you said it, so I didn't need to. I would be happy to hear more that, if you would like to collaborate that more, because I feel it's I might not agree completely with that. It's interesting way to put it, and of course there's been deepening relationships with those countries, but still at the same time it's more like balancing between the US and the other regions, which we've seen also when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. The policies with this war has been very inconsistent from AMLO, I think. Even schizophrenic, I would say. I mean, Mexico has voted to condemn the invasion, but at the same time, it's been very refusing to join the sanctions against Russia. AMLO has been more straightforward, supporting Russia at some point, but then at the same time, Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard has been kind of like being the fireman behind him and, putting the fire down and kind of supporting more Ukraine. So Mexico has tried to keep its distance from the conflict so that it wouldn't harm that or make any harm for its other relationships. And like you mentioned, what AMLO has been commenting on, the comments about the press freedom, or the limiting of press that AMLO has received from Antony Blinken or European countries or Spain as well. This kind of sums it up how AMLO has been kind of like a president who hasn't shown that much personal interest in international relations or foreign affairs, which can be seen also how little he's been traveling abroad or meeting other leaders of the world. But unless it is to complain to Spain or Antony Blinken or other countries how he handles the press, then he is interested, and that's kind of sums it up how he's handling international relations at the moment. But so that it wouldn't be so skeptical and so negative, I'd like to also point two things that I find positive in Mexico lately. For example, last October, same-sex marriage is now legal in all Mexico states. Tamaulipas was the last state in October who voted for it, so there's some progress going on in the human rights sector. And at the same time, for example, I was in the US in last summer when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which we all saw and which shook the whole world. But at the same time, what we haven't really realized is that actually there's been the other kind of development going on in Mexican side, where actually state by state is now accepting abortion access. And so as the US states restrict abortion access, Mexican states are expanding it. And what has happened lately is that when especially the southern states of the US have been limiting the access, now actually women, for example, from Texas are traveling to the other side, to northern Mexico to get abortion. And there's been these secret networks of human rights actors and women that are actually smuggling abortion pills to the other side of the border to the north. So there's also these kind of dynamics. And also, one good news is that there's still very strong grassroots activism, which is really strong in Mexico, and they are doing really good work over there. But that's what I wanted to add for that. We can keep going from that.
Great.
Into that. Great. Thank you to both. Got at least exactly what I was looking for. That is two complementary but slightly different perspectives. Before, I'm going to warn everyone, before we go to questions, comments, you obviously need to and deserve a chance to comment back, especially the question and elaborating about Venezuela trajectory. And then I have a question kind of to both of you, I guess. You mentioned AMLO's attacks against media, Laura. And then, Laura, you mentioned this modus vivendi that was achieved with Trump, who also attacked the media, as we know. Do you think that AMLO would have a preference on U.S. elections in 2024? Is it Biden, Trump, DeSantis, or maybe if you don't mention a name, kind of a general type of character that might be preferred?
I go first. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. So I think he clearly had established a very good working relationship with Trump in a way that, which I think Trump was referring to himself as well. They are both men who are capable of speaking for hours, and for some reason people listen to them for hours as well. And that's still, even in the world of politics, that's a relatively rare skill. So I've wondered about the meetings that they have, because usually when you see either one of them with another political leader, the other person gets to speak a lot less. So I wonder how, who speaks when the two of them are in the room, because at some point, I'd imagine somebody would have to be silent. But yes, I would think that Trump would do very well, because at least in Trump's Republican Party, there would be less pressure to call out many of the sort of internal issues of Mexico. I mean, 2 point in the fiscal year ending in September 2020, 22, 2.7 million people showed up to U.S. border authorities coming across the southern border. Many of them were repeat visitors, so these are not necessarily individual people. Majority even repeat visitors. But that just give you an idea of how many people showed up at the border. And if you compare those kinds of figures even to the sort of migration crisis in Europe in 2015, that's something to think about. That sort of brings me back to, I think, the sort of Venezuela question. I mean, U.S. border authorities even this year said that there's a growing number of Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and even Cubans trying to make the trip via Mexico because they have access to Mexico, then they try to cross over into the U.S. via there. And this is, so that's something to keep in mind. It's that those issues of what would be sort of further east in the Caribbean are now crossing over into the Mexico-U.S. relationship as well. It's not just the cumbre and the decision of AMLO to boycott that, which I think in large part, the other interpretation, it's in the paper, but it's just that he did not realize that he was backing himself into the corner. He thought that he was balancing, he thought that this was like sovereignty-minded Mexico, when in fact in this specific case, he was clearly aligning from the perspective of the U.S. and not just balancing. And that there could just be that he didn't understand the mistake that he took early on by saying that he's going to boycott, and then he ended up, having to remain away. Then again, he did not, one of these many Latin or South American organizations, CELAC, is coming back into force now because Lula decided that he wants to belong to it, Brazil should belong to it, but AMLO is not going to make the trip. AMLO does not care to make trips to these kinds of events. So there's that element as well. Venezuela plays a very, very different kind of role in the politics of the Western Hemisphere. If you look at the numbers of why Trump or why Bolsonaro came so close to winning a second term, when you boil down to the issues, Venezuela looms incredibly large. In 2020, many Americans, when they were asked about this, so sort of why did you go vote for Trump? Something that kept on popping up, and not just in Florida, but especially in places like Florida, is that I don't want to live in Venezuela. Same thing when Bolsonaro was running out of arguments, and I was down in Brazil during the election. When he's running down of arguments in the runoff against Lula, he would always turn to Venezuela. But you're friends with everybody in Caracas. You're friends in Havana. You're friends in Managua. So whenever you talk about this topic, you have to realize that this is part of a sort of right-wing populist playbook across the Western Hemisphere. But that doesn't mean that the problem isn't real. This used to be a rich country. Now there are millions of refugees. And the path that, what was the language that I used here? Centralization, collectivization, corruption, cronyism, and criminality. All of these are present. If we care about what's happening to Brazil Amazons, and I care very much, what's happening in the Orinoco in Venezuela is truly, truly atrocious. I mean, I've written a piece in Foreign Policy calling it ecocide, and I would still sort of stand behind that. So that's on the Venezuelan side. I think the main thing that we can see in Mexico is the dynamic is how much control does the central government have of the territory as a whole, and how much does it need to strike deals with cartel bosses, and then how much of the central government is becoming equated with the military. And those are sort of feed into each other. And if you look at some of the dynamics of Venezuela's military in the early 21st century, in the 90s, getting more involved in the economy of Venezuela, that's a really, I think, a worrying trend as such. But the social connections, the same-sex marriage, abortion, yes, fantastic point. That's another example of how complicated these relations are. And it's a reversal. Just a couple of years earlier, we saw many Mexicans from Nuevo León and many of the states close to Texas and other parts of northern Mexico, crossing over into the U.S. to receive COVID shots. And now the healthcare train on this issue travels in the other direction. But that just speaks to the very close ties between the two countries and how important it is to sort of have a deeper understanding of them. But I think that's, I'm going to hold my breath now before I speak for too long.
I would add only that absolutely I would say also that Trump would be choice of AMLO's if he could choose. Obviously, it doesn't really matter for him that much because 2024 both of the countries will elect new leaders. But also they both admired kind of authoritarian populist leadership styles, so they speak the same language. They understand each other better than Biden and AMLO does. And also when it comes to economics, I would say that Trump wouldn't mind that much if AMLO is not a huge fan of green deals or renewable energies. Instead, he's been nationalizing the petroleum companies and is really speaking for fossil fuels. So that would definitely be one more vote for Trump.
I'll say one thing that triggered about the sort of internal politics of the Republican Party. There's a point in the paper where I mentioned that the same people who voted against it, this is bringing into this room, the same people who the symbolic vote in the House voted against Finland and Sweden are people like Chip Roy, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, all incredibly loud build the wall people, and also vocally against Finland and Sweden. Josh Hawley, the only senator who voted against, and as in a vote that mattered, also in the Build the Wall camp. So there's a Build the Wall caucus that's also against countries like Finland or Sweden for being part of the same thing, in the clear alliance relationship with the United States. At the same time, mentioned Florida, you mentioned DeSantis. DeSantis regularly gives sort of pressers and conferences where he talks about COVID in communist China, Venezuela. We don't want to become Venezuela. We want to be the free state of Florida for everybody. It's some combination of these, and he has flipped a state that used to be 50-50 into a 60-40 state. That shows, there are a lot of things in there, but Venezuela is constantly part of his plan. He rarely goes, very many speeches or comments without bringing up Venezuela. It's one of these things where I think sitting in this room, the perception of what socialism is, or what people in the United States or Brazil or somewhere else should think that what socialism is that of maybe social democrats in Finland or socialist in France or whatever it would be, rather than the perception of the sort of Caribbean socialism. And I think we do a certain disservice in discussing U.S. socialism via figures from Vermont rather than, the full picture of the sort of understanding of what it is on the ground, whether it's in Brazil or whether it's in the U.S. And obviously some of it's also in Mexico. I mean, there are people in Mexico who are vehemently opposed to AMLO simply because he was with the PRI, but he was always with the left of the PRI. And then as soon as he had an opportunity to found a large left-wing party, he went ahead with it. And that he is someone who's nationalizing wealth. So anyway, but at this point, I will stop talking for now.
Thank you to both. And I have to note here, having looked at, for instance, perspectives on arming Ukraine, that there's some difference if there's between socialism in Vermont and Florida, also between Finnish and German and other socialists in terms of arming people. With that digression, first questions, comments? And most people may know you from TV or elsewhere, but if everyone can just introduce themselves. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maria Linden. I'm a researcher here in CUSP, and my research focus is crisis of American democracy. And from that perspective, I wanted to ask both of you, what you anticipate for the 2024 Mexican election. Do you think it's going to be a free and fair election? Is there going to be attempts of foul play? And where do you see the elections taking this US-Mexico relationship? Is it most likely going to be another populist leader, even though the current one can't continue? Or do you think they're going to do a U-turn and start doing something that's more productive for their democracy? Thank you.
I was going to take a few questions, but that is such a broad question that, go ahead, both of you.
Want to go first?
Well, I would say it depends quite a lot what AMLO is going to do now the last year, or last years in power. Now the next question is what he's going to do with INE, the National Election Institute that I mentioned. If he manages to make the reform over there and kick out the people he doesn't like and make a new panel, he's suggesting this kind of new panel. Now there's 11 people in the panel, and he would like to reinstitute 6 new people over there that would be elected, that the citizens could elect from 60 candidates, and those 60 candidates would be chosen by President himself, Congress, and the Supreme Court, 20 each. And then there would be the 6 people panel elected. If this reform and other ideas he has for this election institute, then who knows? But at least quite it's quite sure you could say that it will be from Morena, and it depends on who is his choice. I mean, his opinion matters a lot, and at least for now, Claudia Sheinbaum, the mayor of Mexico City, is the strong candidate. And she would be at least, she's been talking more in favor of green energy, and she would be more optimistic for trade, if we talk about US-Mexico relationship and the nearshoring that we've been talking, which has been the word of the year during the last year when the US is trying to transfer the production and manufacturing from China to Mexico after the pandemic. So for that point of view, Claudia Sheinbaum could be a positive thing for trade. Another names that have been mentioned is the foreign minister, and that's been also the second name that has been popping up. But AMLO has not been willing to say out loud yet who is his favorite, but we'll see.
Marcelo Ebrard I think there's a link in the paper, made a curious comment sometime last summer where he wrote a column calling for the good neighbor policy of the United States to be reinstated. For those of us who like to study the 20th century and early 20th century Western Hemisphere history, that was a shorthand for the U.S. For Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who himself was elected many times, to befriend presidents who liked remaining in power themselves for a very long time, including Vargas in Brazil. So I mean, there's a sort of tendency there of instituting long-standing presidencies and regimes being sort of more set in stone. But Mexico has this brilliant innovation of one-term presidencies, and this held throughout the PRI in the 20th century. It doesn't mean that the previous president wasn't picking. Obviously, the previous president was often involved in picking the candidate, and that's as as Laura says, that's the likely scenario here too, that AMLO has a lot of power to hand over. While that institutional safeguard is there in Mexico, I've spent a lot of time in the last few months thinking about the institutional safeguards in Brazil. Brazil has a very strong judiciary that we've seen at play. It also has much stronger states than Mexico does. And the strong states in the United States is, of course, always, the states can be a problem because, there's a state secretary who wants to count the votes a certain way. But at the same time, as long as it's not the crucial state or the only state that does that, there are lots of state secretaries in other states. So Mexico doesn't have those strong states. It does not have the kind of judiciary that Brazil has. I mean, I'm not sure any other democracy has as strong of a judiciary as Brazil's, and that's a different question and for a different day. But those kinds of countervailing trends are definitely there.
Thank you. And we're going to go here to the. Yep.
Yes, thank you. I'm Ernesto Cespedes, Ambassador of Mexico. Thank you, Charlie, for finally putting Mexico in the agenda of FIA. My 5-year term here is coming to an end, and this is way more than I expected, I would say. The presentation and the paper itself is so broad in scope that I wish I had 2 tequilas and 3 mezcales to be able to deal with all this information. But I would like to point out a couple of things. First, I think everybody understands here where the President López Obrador is coming from in terms of, his political campaigning for 18 years in a country that is stratified as probably very few countries with such a great wealth and so unequally distributed. So again, stratified economically, culturally, with a so diverse and unjust distribution of pretty much everything. So it is not surprising that when people like in Mexico, like in many other countries, were pretty much fed up with traditional policies, politics, he was elected with probably what I don't recall any other president in history who had over 50% of the votes in Mexico. And so he is pretty much strong in that regard. And as you say, he still has 60% of popularity, which is not easy in a country that it is not recently divided. It's a country that was probably born divided as a country. For domestic politics, I'm going to stay there. We have been already in pre-campaigns, pre-campaigns, and my own boss is a pre candidate. And what I would point out here is that the U.S.-Mexico relations, as the presenter pointed out, is complex. It runs in so many levels that it is difficult to grasp at a glance. I will say that for starters, that trade, economic relationship, Mexico and the U.S. I'm not going to talk about investment, just trade flows. It equals a little over $1 million per minute, $1.5 billion a day. In comparison, the Mexico-China trade relation equals around 2 months of that trade, and the Mexico-Russia relations equals to less than 2 days of that trade. So that's, if that is an indicator not only of trade, but of the importance that naturally an interest-based foreign policy gives to any of these countries, that will tell you something. All right. So then, in terms of just a little bit of a perspective in the COVID the COVID period in 2020, in the shutdown of the Mexican economy, the U.S. put a lot of pressure on Mexico to start, to open up and start working again to keep the supply chain going for what the U.S. economy demanded. You would think about food, you would think about cars, you would think about electronics, obviously. But there are things, I mean, the Pentagon was putting a little bit of pressure there. So there are things, there are parts, there are spare parts of vehicles and aircrafts and who knows what that is critical for national defense that need to be gotten from Mexico. That we complied, that cost lives, but we were there. So no wonder then that when we are talking about trust, nearshoring, friendshoring, Mexico, of course, and Canada, they are number one on the list. And and as a result of the Three Amigos, as it is widely known, or the North American Summit last week, or 2 weeks ago in Mexico City, that electromobility, lithium batteries, semiconductors, they were also number one on the list for future U.S. investments in Mexico, despite the energy dispute, despite any other issues, again, organized crime, migration, which is in a situation that I personally, as a foreign service professional, had never seen before, and I have dealt with the issue myself. So this is as strong and as deep as the relationship is. Finally, Russia and Ukraine and Mexican foreign policy. Yes, the president has said many, many things, but I would like to refer to the votes at the UN and the stance Mexico has had in other fora. As non-permanent member of the Security Council till December 31st of last year, Mexico was very active and promoted, along with France, a resolution condemning the invasion. We don't call it military operation or anything like that, the invasion of Russia to the Ukraine. And of course, at the Security Council, it was immediately vetoed. So Mexico and France took it to the General Assembly, and it was incredibly successful in getting past there, with the usual suspects voting against or abstaining, or some of them were out of the room. But Mexico was there at the forefront. And that and a couple of other resolutions. However, and we have explained that to our European friends and partners and North American partners, the limit comes when it comes to sanctions, but especially when it comes to suspending Russia from any fora, be it the Human Rights Council, be it you name it, main and subsidiary bodies of the UN. Why? Because we think that if Russia is suspended and it is not there, there is no accountability of their actions. By not having them there, they might get away with whatever they want without having to account for anything. G20, the G20 in Indonesia, in Bali. Mexico is part of the G20, and we had the same stance at the summit in Bali last December. The G7 were blocking every single resolution, every single document, because Russia was there. Mexico, Indonesia, the chairs of the summit, the hosts, Argentina, and other emerging economies part of the G20, what they aimed for was to have a text, was pretty much the G20 not to die. And we achieved it, and I say we because it's the Mexican foreign policy and Mexican negotiators there, through convincing the G7 that the text had to include everybody's views, but also to reflect that what Russia was doing was not harming only Europe, only Ukraine. It was harming everybody through energy costs, through inflation, through shortages of whatever. And it was not only hurting the rich, not only hurting Mexico, which is what President López Obrador is very adamant on, the inflation and energy costs that the Ukraine and Russia war is creating. Not only middle-income countries, but the poorest of the poor in the world. That was the key, and there is a declaration. I would stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, and I'm glad that we could have your comments, reflections on your experience. Do you have any quick thoughts? And then I'm going to look for other hands up here. Oh.
I have nothing more to add, but thank you for clarifying, especially the Ukraine-Russia part. That's really good explanation and kind of like giving the context and the framework for those. So thank you for that.
Right. And take here, and then we'll take 2 questions now just to make sure we can. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Ivan Medvedsky. I'm Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of Hungary here in Mexico, in Helsinki, sorry. A little bit confused.
A little bit of Mexico,
yeah.
Right here.
Again. So I will have a question and a comment, if you let me make them. First of all, I give you permission, Mr. Ambassador, to nominate myself as an advocate for Mexican reputation, for my love for Mexico and Mexican people. Please, the word decay in English, maybe my English is quite poor, is decadencia en español, ¿verdad? Decadencia, ¿no? Decadencia. In this respect, I think it's a very, very strong word. And especially because we are looking at Mexico from a very European perspective. Decay must come from the very tragical history of the country itself. As Mr. Ambassador said, Mexico was born divided, was born by violence, let's say. And when Laura was talking about the cultural heritage of the country regarding the women's right, the feminist side in English, maybe, feminicidios, and obviously the killing of journalists. Of course, I don't agree with that. One killed journalist is much more than expected. So when we talk about decay from European perspective, my question is, what would the tools might be to help Mexico to fight these challenges? taking in consideration the fact that exportation of Western values have failed several times in the past. So this is a very, very big challenge, not only for Mexico, but for whole Latin America, I suppose. What can we do and what we should do, and shall we do anything anyway? This was the question. My remarks is regarding US-Mexican relations. I think that Mexico is a professional actor in this case. If not, I'm convinced that the borderline of Texas would be at Monterrey, San Luis de Potosí, or even Veracruz. So Mexico is a very important actor in the relations. There is a very strong mutual interdependence. I don't have actual numbers. My study is like 6 years old, but at that time I've learned out that 5 million US households directly or indirectly depend on Mexican labor force. So this is an interdependence which is in the interest of US as well. And the last one, when the last election campaign in 2017, Enrique Peña Nieto, president of that time, was blamed about not doing anything with the narcos and with the smuggling of drugs. Then he asked his US counterparts, gentlemen, 70–80% of the guns that were taken from the narcos were sold in the US and taken to Mexico. The largest market for the Mexican drugs is US. And I don't know how many billion of US dollars in cash are sent without any checking from the US to Mexico. So until this system works, sorry, but we cannot do anything. Thank you.
I think it's unofficially, I guess, the number that is expected the narcos make is it is 30 to 40 billion annually. Counting many things, of course, you can get a bigger or smaller number, but gives you an idea of the scale of also how much resources they have compared to a state or so. But there's a question here, if you can take that.
Well, good afternoon. I'm the ambassador of Chile, and just want to thank FIA for pointing a little bit your eyesight on Latin America. Whether it's critical or not, it gives us food for thought. The paper is very compelling in the sense that it tackles many issues. Probably something that could have been more highlighted is the role of Mexico in the multilateral arena, which the ambassador has highlighted, and Lori had very well mentioned on the OCDE. Here we mentioned the G20, but also APEC, Alianza del Pacífico, and CELAC that Lori also mentioned, which is very important now to point out that, you know, we had the summit in Argentina recently. There was a declaration whether Mexico, I mean, had representation, but obviously AMLO, you know, had his point there. But I would say that there's a declaration. But this CELAC is also going to have a summit in June with the EU. So there, Mexico has always been very pivotal. So I think those elements are important. But I have a question, and thanks to Lori for pointing out also the OAS. I understand that you're very savvy on this matter. I want to ask you whether you believe that the OAS, the Organization of American States, has failed in some way in articulating a better dialogue within the region and between the actors, because obviously probably we would have had a different take from, you know, this, what you have mentioned, you know, like the points by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So that would be my question, if you can deliver a little bit on that and the Inter-American Declaration, because I think it's very pertinent to have it here, and that discussion obviously will give us different views, and well, thank you.
Yeah, I think from a Washington perspective, the Summit of the Americas process regime is not seen quite as tied to the OAS as perhaps outside Washington. The two are seen as traveling together very close. And in some ways, I think the Summit of America's regime has been seen as, nobody would ever put it this way, but as an alternative, another way to engage those who have reasons, good and bad, to be discontented with the OAS. So I think now that Biden wanted to resuscitate the Summit of the Americas regime and get it some sort of coverage in the U.S. as well. I was watching it both in CNN Español and on CNN. CNN Español was the entire week, and then the week before and the week after, only on this. In the U.S., the only thing that people heard was that AMLO hates America. And it was a really, and because I completely agree that, there's been a shift here too, because, as much as there's sort of fear of the Mexican president's allegiances and interests, I completely agree that, that obviously his foreign minister has been trying to play a much broader sort of multilateral game at the same time. Mexico has really an abundance of free trade agreements. I didn't mention the trade aspect by accident. There's some agreements that shouldn't exist. There's a free trade agreement with Uruguay, and obviously Uruguay is part of Mercosur, and this should not happen. So it's that level of savviness and craftiness that exists, and that's why it often is a sort of entry point also for not just the Uruguayans to enter the U.S. market, but for many others around the world. So that's something. By the way, the 30 and 40 billion to about 40 billion that you mentioned also happens to be the number that's in the energy dispute right now. On the investments, the different sides have slightly different numbers, but those are the kinds of figures we're talking about. On the point of the guns, absolutely. That is a huge problem in the relationship. There's a lawsuit from about a year ago, or maybe a little over a year ago by this point, precisely on this point. Lawsuits, suing the gun manufacturers, for all the crime caused in the U.S. gun manufacturers, for all the crimes caused in Mexico. Also, you mentioned narcotics. I mentioned fentanyl here. But there's also, and this is partly COVID related, it has to do with U.S. cultural values and laws changing around the use of narcotics, people using narcotics legally, illegally in places where 20 years ago this would have just not happened. So there's a mismatch here between the way outside the federal state of the United States the drug war still takes place in the way that it's being pursued, and the actual lived practices of people within the borders of the United States. So that's a very, very, very good point. What I do take issue with is perhaps the sort of the European sense of democratic decay. I think in my comments here and in the paper as well, I try to couch it as much as well as I can within sort of Western Hemisphere context. And I specifically say that the amount of attention that's been paid to Jair Bolsonaro, for good reason, I've written a lot more on Jair Bolsonaro than I've written on AMLO, there's similar sorts of tendencies, and I think the institutions that we should be looking at are the institutions of those of large federal states in the New World. That's why when I make comparisons, they're usually to the US or to Brazil. Some other countries of Hispanic America also come to mind, but those are, I think, the more relevant points of comparison, perhaps, than the European ones. In terms of what can we do, I mean, certainly we should call out the death of journalists. When AMLO specifically sets his target at a journalist, that is La Mañanera, and I think that is something incredibly dangerous, and he's doing that on purpose. I mean, the criminality as such is a difficult one, because you mentioned the violence. There's a difficult way of covering that without getting into sort of the romance of violence, or then talking about Mexican violence as atavistic in some way. And it's a very difficult topic, I think, for outsiders to broach when it comes to the Mexican Revolution and what was inherited from there in terms of Mexican culture. And try to sort of steer away from that. I did mention that it was the first utopia of the 20th century, which I've always found as an interesting way of framing it, the Mexican Revolution. But I'll leave that at that. I think I pretty much covered everything. Do you want to?
I would like to add, you asked for the tools on how to prevent or how to improve the democracy and what could be done for the journalist killings or to prevent the journalist killings and feminicidios. And I would start with, the main point would be to start with the impunity problem. There's like 10 women are killed daily in Mexico, and then perhaps one of the perpetrators is actually brought in front of a court. And I find that's the main problem. The perpetrators should be brought in front of the court. They should be persecuted. There should be more resources, more money for that, for evidence gathering, for presenting suspects. Often the suspects are even not known. Also, are officials even investigating the cases? Often they're not. Are they trustworthy, or are they perhaps working with organized crime? Are they getting money from criminal gangs? Those are the main issues that should be fixed first, I would say. Then also, another point of view would be the human rights defenders, who are also there. Like I said, there's a massive network of human rights organizations working against feminicidios, but also they are silenced. And there is a mechanism that was established 2012, if I recall, that is protecting journalists and human rights defenders, but it's not enough. It doesn't have enough resources to actually, because even those women and those activists who are under the protection are killed. So that would be definitely the starting point to start fixing this problem. But also there is the bigger layer that you mentioned, the culture of patriarchy and machismo, which is not fixed easily. It's there, and that doesn't change unless attitudes and education and all this is changed somehow, or there is a lot of this kind of like passion crimes kind of romanticizing over the topic, and the women are not often believed if they tell what has happened, or if there's a fear of violence. They're kind of like downsizing, and AMLO is doing the same. He's doing the same for press, but he's actually mentioned also that women who are saying that they are facing threats from their spouse or someone else around them. He also said something like most of the phone calls that 911 gets are prank calls. So even if president is talking like that about the violence against women, that is not really helping the issue. Instead, the government launched this advertisement campaign that encouraged men to count from 1 to 10 if they are feeling angry. Well, that's not really, probably not the right advice to do. Rather just give more money and resources for courts and police.
I'll just add, I just remembered that there's a mention of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and that I think if we could breathe some sort of air into that process, I think that would be great. That would be a way for the OAS to play a positive, active role, and only Cuba is not a signatory, so, you know.
It's not a signatory because it was expelled from the U.S.
No, that's exactly, exactly.
In the 40s.
But you know, everybody else has signed up as a country, so that
charter is the origin of the Summit of the Americas.
Yeah.
2007.
Yeah, exactly. So that was actually right around the same days. That was 2000. I think they signed on the September 10th, 11th, or 12th, exactly around the same in 2001. So it has its origin at a very, very interesting point in time. Colin Powell had to fly off to somewhere else very soon.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking at the clock. I appreciate we're a few minutes over time. First, I want to thank Lauri and Laura, as well as Fia's Mayu and Mayu. We only do double letters in all these things.
Yeah.
So if I can ask for a round of applause for them first. And then thank you, audience, for coming here, asking questions, comments. I'm glad if we were able to provide any intellectual nourishments and thoughts and some policy advice on this. I promise this will not be the last event on the Western Hemisphere if I have anything to do with it. So thank you very much, and the seminar is now closed.